It was over almost as soon as it began. In a small, dimly lit gym, surrounded by those who had trained for decades, Bruce Lee faced a line of senior martial artists. Observers said he moved without hesitation, without flourish. Within 2 minutes, every doubt they had about his skill, his speed, his presence was quietly erased. No one left bruised beyond the lesson learned. No one left victorious. Only a subtle, undeniable shift in understanding that a new measure of mastery had quietly arrived. The gym was not a place for show. Its wooden floors were scuffed with decades of practice, each mark a record of repeated strikes, falls, and corrections. The walls were lined with shelves of trophies and faded photographs, but it was the air itself that carried authority, the quiet presence of history. Every corner, every beam, seemed to watch the movements of those who entered. Inside, senior martial artists moved with a rhythm born of years, even decades of repetition. Their postures were measured, their eyes precise. One adjusted his belt, another shifted his stance, each action almost ceremonial. They were not performing, they were custodians, silently reminding the space of its own weight. Visitors to the gym noted the contrast immediately. Here, motion was deliberate, almost slow, but behind it lay unspoken power. Conversation was minimal. Instructions were given in fragments, yet each word carried weight. These men had long practiced the art of control of body, of technique, of expectation. Among them, the tension was not visible in the form of anger or competitiveness. It existed quietly, like a low hum, beneath the surface. Every student, every observer entering the space felt it immediately. This was not merely training. This was a place where mastery had its own quiet code, and the keepers of that code were alert to any challenge, however subtle. Even before Bruce Lee arrived, the room seemed to breathe differently. The elders' awareness extended beyond themselves. They sensed patterns, anticipated reactions, measured the potential of anyone who entered. It was in this environment, heavy with tradition and patient authority, that the story would unfold. No one moved unnecessarily. No one spoke louder than required. Every action was measured, intentional, carrying a weight that could only be understood with observation. Here, mastery was silent, but palpable, and every visitor would sense that they were entering a threshold. By the time Bruce Lee's presence was noted, the room had already set its tone. Calm, controlled, authoritative. Every observer understood that this was more than a gym. It was a crucible, and the keepers of the space were ready, not with hostility, but with the quiet certainty of those who had seen decades pass and believed their understanding of skill to be absolute. Yet the weight of that certainty, heavy as it was, would not remain unchallenged. He entered without announcement, without fanfare. The door swung open gently, and a young man stepped into the space, his movements deliberate, yet without any effort to command attention. Bruce Lee carried nothing but himself, light on his feet, eyes quietly observing, posture upright but relaxed. There was no exaggeration in his stride, no attempt to impress. And yet the room changed. The senior martial artists, seated or standing in measured positions, noted the newcomer immediately. Some adjusted their stance, as though instinctively preparing. Others simply watched, eyes narrowing slightly, taking in his frame, his gaze, the subtle control he exhibited over his own body. The contrast was immediate. Here was youth against experience, a smaller figure against a line of men who had long mastered authority through decades of practice. Bruce Lee did not speak. There was no greeting, no formal introduction. He moved with a quiet confidence, an awareness of the space and its occupants that required no declaration. Observers later remarked that he seemed to measure the room in seconds, its length, its weight, the angles of approach, the breathing of those within it. And in that measurement, he carried an ease that unsettled some, intrigued others. The elders, for their part, did not react with hostility. Their training had taught them patience. Yet subtle cues betrayed their attention. A shift in weight, the tightening of a fist, a small tightening around the eyes. They had expected skill, certainly, perhaps even ambition, but what they could not yet comprehend was the precision in stillness, the economy of motion that the young man displayed before a single strike had been attempted. In those quiet moments, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Conversations halted, movements slowed, even the ambient sounds, the scrape of a shoe on the floor, the soft creak of a wooden beam, felt amplified. Bruce Lee's presence required nothing. It demanded only observation, and in doing so, it quietly unsettled the expectations that had been long held by the custodians of the gym. It was clear, even then, that something was about to occur. Not in a flash of violence, not in the exaggerated gestures of showmanship, but in the subtle intersection of awareness, timing, and skill. And while the elders maintained their composure, an unspoken question lingered. Could experience alone contain this new measure of mastery? The elders exchanged brief glances. Not hostile, not mocking, simply measured observations, as though silently comparing notes. In the language of experience, every small gesture spoke volumes. A shift in stance, a tightening of shoulders, a pause in breath. They had seen many young challengers, some brash, some technically precise. But none had arrived carrying this quiet confidence, this stillness of intent. Whispers traveled just above the edge of audibility. One questioned his frame, another noted the youth of his hands. The murmurs were cautious. No one spoke loudly enough to break the rhythm of the room. Doubt began to ripple through the gathering. Not of arrogance, but of anticipation. Each senior had long assumed mastery could be measured by experience alone. That assumption now trembled. Every movement in the gym seemed amplified in their perception. A foot shifted, a hand adjusted, and instinctively they tested their own reflexes, their own expectations. Could their techniques, honed over decades, anticipate the minimal, almost invisible signals of this challenger? The question lingered, unspoken, and with it, the tension grew. Not chaotic, not loud, but taut, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. It was here, in this quiet storm of mental preparation, that Bruce Lee's advantage began to form. He did nothing overt to unsettle them. No words, no gestures. Yet his mere presence forced an internal recalibration. The elders, accustomed to commanding respect through visible authority, now found themselves measured against something that could not be weighed with the usual metrics. Efficiency of movement, sharpness of perception, adaptability in silence. Time slowed in the room. Observers later noted that even the air seemed thicker, charged with the collective anticipation of men who had always relied on certainty. They could not yet see the method, could not yet grasp the approach. All they felt was the quiet inevitability that something significant was about to occur. And in that inevitability, doubt, small at first, then insistent, began to replace confidence. It was a subtle shift. Not a collapse, not yet. But the room, once stable in its hierarchy, began to tremble beneath the weight of silent scrutiny. And in the midst of that tension, Bruce Lee remained still, patient, waiting only for the moment to act with precision. Without a word, Bruce Lee moved. There was no announcement, no signal, no flourish of intent. One observer later described it simply. It began quietly, and yet it could not be ignored. Each movement was deliberate, economical, stripped of all excess. He advanced only as necessary, responded only when provoked, and each action was precise enough to expose even the smallest error in technique. The senior martial artists watched closely, their own motions restrained. When one tested him, a subtle forward strike, a minimal probing kick, Bruce Lee met it with only what was required. He absorbed the motion, redirected energy, and released it without force beyond necessity. There were no dramatic leaps, no exaggerated strikes. Yet each intervention left no room for doubt, no opportunity for counter. Efficiency became authority. Silence became control. Observers later recounted the room's stillness. There were no gasps, no sudden movements, only a careful measurement of motion and reaction. Every observer could feel the shift in balance, the recalibration of expectation. A single flick of the wrist, a step to the side, a subtle adjustment of weight, each small gesture held significance far beyond its appearance. It was not speed for spectacle. It was speed for inevitability. The elders, those accustomed to decades of mastery, adjusted. They adapted moment by moment, instinctively, yet each response only revealed the depth of Bruce Lee's understanding. His mastery was not the result of raw strength or aggressive domination. It was a complete comprehension of timing, leverage, and presence. In this quiet demonstration, he communicated more in seconds than some could in years of teaching. Even the observers unfamiliar with martial arts could sense it. Something had shifted. The hierarchy, long assumed absolute, began to dissolve, not violently but psychologically. Each senior, despite his own skill, felt the subtle recalibration of authority. It was over in moments that felt simultaneously long and precise, leaving the room suspended in recognition of a new standard. By the time Bruce Lee stepped back, the silence had weight. The demonstration required no commentary, demanded no applause. The message was clear and undeniable. Mastery had arrived in a form that the elders had not anticipated, and yet could not deny. In the minutes that followed, the room remained silent, yet the tension had shifted. What had begun as quiet observation now transformed into introspection. The senior martial artists, each accustomed to certainty born of experience, began to recognize the limits of that certainty. Every assumption about dominance, technique, and authority was quietly challenged. One by one, subtle signs of recalibration appeared. A hand lingered in thought, a stance relaxed after defensive tension, an eyebrow lifted in acknowledgement. None of these gestures were loud or dramatic, but each was a mark of internal adjustment. The masters had not been defeated in a conventional sense. No one had fallen, no one had been struck violently. Yet their hierarchy had fractured, not through aggression, but through clarity, precision, and restraint. Observers later recounted the psychological weight of that moment. Even those who had doubted Bruce Lee now saw the inevitability of his mastery. There was no anger, no resentment, only an almost reverential understanding. The young challenger had not fought them in the ways they expected. He had redefined the terms of engagement. Each elder, in confronting the subtlety and decisiveness of his technique, confronted their own assumptions about skill, control, and the nature of mastery itself. It was in this quiet collapse of expectation that the most profound lessons emerged. Authority did not need to be loud, nor dominance enforced with force. Precision, timing, and restraint conveyed more than raw power ever could. The elders recognized this immediately, and though their pride remained intact, their perspective had irrevocably shifted. By the end of the demonstration, the room had changed. Not physically, but psychologically. Those who had entered confident in their absolute mastery now carried the memory of someone who moved differently, thought differently, and commanded space without confrontation. The encounter had left no visible marks, yet its imprint was permanent. A subtle, undeniable shift in understanding that would linger long after the doors closed. In the quiet aftermath, Bruce Lee remained composed. There was no boast, no gesture to demand recognition. The shift had occurred silently, invisibly, yet its effects were complete. Mastery, as it would be remembered, was not loud. It was precise, and it required nothing more than presence, clarity, and restraint. Years later, those present would speak of the event not as a spectacle, but as a quiet pivot in understanding. The gym itself had not changed. Its floors still bore the scuffs of practice. The walls still displayed the faded photographs of earlier generations. But the memory of that day transformed the culture within. Bruce Lee's demonstration became less about an individual victory and more about the standard he set for all who trained there. The elders, once certain in the hierarchy of experience, continued their teaching, but their approach subtly shifted. Observation replaced assumption. They encouraged attentiveness to nuance, to timing, to the invisible currents of movement. Students learned that mastery was not shown in forceful displays, but in the efficiency of action and the clarity of presence. The story of Bruce Lee's brief, 2-minute encounter circulated quietly, retold in measured tones, often with a pause that allowed the weight of the lesson to settle. Even those outside the gym, who heard second-hand accounts, noted its understated significance. What had occurred was not about defeating opponents. It was about demonstrating an entirely new measure of understanding. Over time, the narrative took on the form of legend, less for spectacle and more for the recalibration it inspired. The quiet authority of a small, disciplined figure had reshaped perceptions, subtly altering how martial artists approached training, discipline, and respect for the craft itself. Observers recalled that no one spoke of winning in the conventional sense. There were no celebrations, no loud affirmations. The impact was psychological and enduring. Each elder, each student, carried a measure of that 2-minute encounter with them, a silent benchmark of clarity and efficiency that informed every decision, every movement, for years afterward. The legacy of that day was reflected in the stillness of practice, the attention to subtlety, the restraint in action. Bruce Lee's demonstration left a quiet, indelible mark. Mastery was not loud. It was not showy. It was measured, precise, and deeply influential, reverberating through time in the minds and actions of those who had witnessed it. The story became less about a single man's skill and more about the enduring lesson that authority, when exercised with clarity and restraint, leaves a permanent imprint, not on the body, but on the understanding of those who observe it. The gym remained a place of tradition, but no longer only of tradition. It became a place where the silent benchmark of mastery, introduced in less than 2 minutes, continued to shape generations. And in the quiet reflection that followed each training session, the lesson endured. Mastery speaks softly, yet its echo is unmistakable.